Shall we get this show on the road then? Because we've already started the conversation, Anne. I mean, we've been talking for a bit prior to this anyway. So, welcome everyone to today's session and thank you for joining us. So, the first week we talked a bit about resilience, some of you were there. The second one, last week, we talked on around the idea of values, what do we value and how's that changing. And this week, then, we're sort of going more from the conceptual to a bit more skills based and something perhaps a little bit more practically useful afterwards, in that we're talking about how to have a meaningful conversation in a challenging context. And right now we're in a really challenging context, and so I'm sure an awful lot of people are familiar with more challenging conversations and what we're going, and also the ingredients of a good conversation, what makes a good conversation. And Anne, I'm very lucky to have here today, because Anne, who's the executive director of Roots to Resilience and who is in South Africa at the moment, but actually lives in the UK, but went out to South Africa just before lockdown and then got locked down there. So you're pretty much there for a while, aren't you
four
now?
months now.
4 months.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. So actually, and we work together, and we've been having to have conversations a lot online. And so one thing we're also going to bring up today, because it's so relevant to all of us, whether you're a student having Zoom lessons or Microsoft Meet, other brands are available, wink, or whether you are an adult and you've been listening to lots of webinars or whatever, this digital form of communication with the additional barriers that it places, it's something else. And to what extent do the other variables at play in a digital conversation impact what makes up a good conversation? Is it the same thing as if we were bodily in the same room? So much to talk about. Lucky we've got Anne here, and at the end of the session we have a fantastic takeaway for you, which I think the easiest thing is that if I email that to you, if you definitely don't want me to email that to me, to you, in fact, just let me know in the chat, or let me know somehow, and I won't. But that will be a really useful resource for you after that. So I think we'll start with you all, and not necessarily that you're able to participate in the chat function, but just for a sort of few seconds, think about what makes a good conversation from your perspective, from your experience. What are the key ingredients of a good conversation? Now, as you think of some of those, feel free to drop them in the chat box at any point in this next hour's discussion. And we'll return to some of those if we can. But even if you're just writing it down on a piece of paper or keeping it in your head, start with what makes a good conversation. And the other thing to think about is what makes a challenging conversation. And we're not going to necessarily ask you to talk about what makes a challenging conversation. As you think about what makes a challenging conversation, probably simultaneously with what makes a good conversation, because you're thinking about what isn't a good conversation, what themes or topics arise? Oh, fantastic! Thank you. The what themes or topics have do you struggle with in a difficult conversation? But I'm going to hand over to Anne on that one, because I want her immediate thoughts on that first question, particularly what makes a good conversation. So Harveen's already put a comment on the ability to stay engaged with the conversation and showing that you're interested in listening clearly. Oh yes, listening.
Yes. Which is probably spot on in terms of what it is that I learned first off and really do appreciate about conversations. And before I go into some of that, I think what I realize a lot of the time is that it's so scary to have your voice heard. It's so scary to speak up and to say something because, as we've spoken about, but you make yourself vulnerable when you do. And entering into conversations means that you've got all these opportunities to put yourself at risk. So I really do appreciate that you're putting some notes in the chat group already, guys. Thank you so much, because that you're letting your voice be heard, and I think that is one of the most important things to having a good conversation, is making yourself vulnerable so that the other can engage. But yeah, I thought, Harriet, I thought I'd go into just looking at my life story a little bit, or what I've learned along the way, because that's really helped me to getting where I'm at, where I am. When I started off, I'm the youngest of six kids. And so if any of you are the youngest, you might know this well, but you don't often get much airtime. In fact, just being six kids, you don't get much airtime. I realized one of my sisters started to speak really fast, and none of us understood why she spoke really fast. And it turned out that because you only had about 30 seconds to get your voice in, if you did, so you put it all in there. But being the youngest, I was quite shy. If anything, I was the person who would just go around from one person to the next, hugging them. But I didn't really say much. But in being quiet, I learned to listen, and I learned to, and listening was amazing, and listening and observing. And I think probably that is my number one thing for a conversation. And especially if you're struggling to hear your voice or you're feeling nervous in a conversation, what I'd really like to say is to start by just listening to what the other person is bringing. Bring your attention to them. Observe what's going on. You can observe their facial features, or if you can't see them, observe what they're saying. Can you hear a nervousness? Can you hear an excitement? Do you sense something's important to them? So, starting off with listening has been one of the most important things that I learned early on, and only because I was forced to. But I think actually, as young people, you probably are told to listen a lot more than you get to speak. So, you're already set in, especially in schools and things like that. So you probably get a lot of experience. Um, the next point that stood out for me, and I found this to be quite a pivotal point for me, was when I was probably about 12 years old. So we call them grades. I was in grade 5.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my teachers set up the space for us to have a debate. And up until that point, I'd never seen a debate, I'd never been a part of a debate.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just an unknown. And what was amazing is that I remember wanting to say something and couldn't say it. And she saw me and she gave me like the nudge. She gave me permission. And I bashed my hands on the table and I said, "No, this is wrong." And I can't remember now what we were talking about, but I just remember the feeling of being able to express myself. And so a couple things came out from that. But one, she created the space to have a conversation. And I wonder how often you're aware of that. Is the space being created to have that conversation? Is the person listening that you're having the conversation with? Are you listening? Are you distracted? Is it safe? What is the environment like? And if we can create those environments, I found this, so working in corporates, I found it to be incredibly important, is to set that context, to be able to have those conversations. The other thing was just, wow, it is amazing once you can free your voice. I think that was for me something that was liberating. Up until that point, I didn't think I could, and suddenly I was given permission to free my voice. And so that's the other thing I would say to encourage you is just start, have conversations, get them wrong, get it, say the wrong thing, whatever it might be, but just start, because the more you do it, the more you get comfortable with having conversations.
I think you've raised a couple of really interesting points there about why some conversations are more challenging, and in terms of vulnerability, it makes us vulnerable, and creating the right spaces to make sure that people don't feel too vulnerable, or and that vulnerability from my experience is often because we're worried about being judged in some way, whether it's in terms of our delivery or in terms of what we're actually saying. Everyone's worried about being found out in some way, whether that's for our knowledge or lack of knowledge or whatever it is that makes us vulnerable. But so you've worked a lot with training in the corporate sector, and now working more with young people. And my background has been a lot with working with teachers and training trainers as well as young people. And when in order to discuss really difficult issues like global complex issues, like the real depth of understanding poverty, for example, or understanding something that's controversial. And that's where we're particularly vulnerable, because not only are we going to be exposing how much we do or don't know about that, we're going to be exposing our opinions and values, and they may be very different from someone else's. And so, what we have always put in place, and it's not always easy, but we um, aspire to, is to create a space that's open for dialogue and inquiry, that is safe, that safety space, so that people feel like they're able to expose their different thoughts, or their potentially different thoughts from the people they're with, and not be, well, they may be judged, but not in a defensive way, not in a way that's going to be really deeply uncomfortable. And that's something we mentioned earlier, wasn't it? The sitting with the discomfort. Because when we're unpacking what makes a good conversation, we're unpacking with what makes a difficult conversation. And from your experience, Anne, and on sort of training sessions with both adults and younger people, what tends to be some of the concerns or challenges or worries about the art of conversation?
What I notice with in the corporate space is that a lot of the time the conversation has to happen because there's an element of judgment that needs to take place. So I've been working with you. There's a problem with the way we're working together. I'm getting frustrated, and I need to have this conversation with you. And there's worry about how will people interpret it, and I like being liked, and now I'm going to raise this, and you're never going to like me again, which I don't think is completely untrue for younger people. I think sometimes younger people also feel like I don't want to raise that because I'm scared that you won't like me. So what we used to work on quite a bit, what I was working on there quite a bit, is how do you start that conversation so that it doesn't come across with judgments, because I think that is where it does go wrong, is that already when you're being given feedback or when you're on the receiving end of a challenging conversation, and in this instance where I need to improve or I have to do something better, there's often two sides to the story, and there's a lot of truth that isn't truth, that's just story. So instead of going, Harriet, you suck at your job, which isn't helpful, you're not going to like it, it's going to make you feel like you're this small, I could rather go, you know, this report that you were supposed to write, it has riddled with spelling errors, if it is, or there are one or two spelling errors. And it just, I was wondering if you noticed those spelling errors, and I wondered if you realized the implications of those spelling errors. Now we can just have a conversation about the work that you're doing rather than about me judging your character. So the concerns are about being liked and how people will respond, and realizing that some people have these blowouts, and how do I respond to a blowout, and how do I avoid those blowouts. So that's what I noticed most. In dealing with younger people, I have found it's often their vulnerability. What happens if I sound stupid? And I don't want to sound stupid. And that's what I notice quite a bit. And maybe I should know that, and I'm scared if I speak up that I'm going to be told off. So that's probably where I speak more about getting comfortable with how do you put things on the table, knowing that they might be wrong, and it's not the end of the world, which is really interesting because when you're talking about these bigger world issues, so thinking of Black Lives Matter, of poverty, racism generally, gender inequality, where you see things going wrong on Twitter, on social media, is people blurting out a statement without thinking about the consequence, and it's not really a conversation. So it's just so much. I mean, every statement you interpret that with so many different thoughts, and that interpretation can then spiral into something else, which I think is why it's quite risky to just go and blurt things out on social media without thinking about the consequences. Whereas when you have a one-on-one conversation or a small group conversation, it becomes easier because you can say it, you can make the mistake, and you have the opportunity to explain where you're coming from and why you've said what it is that you're saying.
Is there not I mean, there isn't the key difference between something like putting a statement on social media and having a conversation like this. The fact that that's more actually, I mean, it really does vary. But sometimes social media is put out there just to share information. There's an information, a repost, a share of it, an article, or a position statement. Sometimes on things like Facebook or whatever the other social media that you would use, you put out a question because you want an interaction, but that form of interaction is not necessarily a dialogue unless you've followed the interaction with another interaction. That what's going back to that original question about what the ingredients of a conversation, any conversation, good or bad, but particularly we're working with good, is the element of reciprocity. That came up a lot last week, actually. Reciprocity, that I want to listen to you and I want to hear your voice and I hear what you've got to say because I want to empathize with your position, but I want that back too, because otherwise there's a power imbalance. There's a hierarchy somehow, and now some conversations are going to have a hierarchy and a power relation that there's nothing we can do about it. So a boss with their employee, or indeed a teacher and a student sometimes, but that's not always the case. But to be valued, you need to feel you're going to get something in return. That reciprocity thing, I think, is fascinating. And also something you were saying about conversations is also another ingredient, is being aware of what their purpose is. What's the purpose of having, why are you sitting down chatting to that person? Now it may well be you want to have, and you want to feel better, you want to reconnect with that person, or you want to hear their opinion about something, or you just want to rant at them because you've got something on your chest you need to get off it, and there's a purpose. That's a purpose in itself. But to keep friends with that person you're ranting at, you need to hear their voice a little bit too. And if you're asking for their opinion on something, they need to feel like you're going to listen. Otherwise, what's the point in giving it? So that reciprocity is an interesting one, and being aware of what the ultimate purpose is. And, a question to you is: Does a conversation always have a purpose? Or I think you reframed that earlier. Sort of, does it?
Does somebody always have to win in a conversation?
Oh, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Does someone always have to win? Is there always sort of a winner or a loser?
I think that's so a lot of what you are touching on, it comes into the intention of the conversation. So why are we having the conversation? And I think sometimes we don't really think about that question. So really great people to have a look at is Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen. Sheila Heen is the person that did the TED Talk.
Yeah.
But they've got difficult conversations, and then thanks for the feedback. So if you ever want to read more, I definitely recommend those two books. And the almost step number one is thinking about what is your intent. Oh, I'm sorry. Step number two is thinking about what is your intention in terms of having this conversation. So the first one is, if we go into conversations thinking we need to win, it's going to be a difficult conversation. and it also speaks to that mindset of yes, but like if it doesn't have to be that only one view is right. And I think that is one of the most freeing things to get over, this idea of I don't have to be right in this conversation. I'm just bringing something to the forefront for us to discuss. So I would actually say most of the time, you really want to stop that mindset of I have to win. If you want to bring winning into it, then think win-win. How do we both win from this conversation? What is going to be a good outcome for both of us? Because let's face it, you're not going to want to have conversations with somebody who always wants you to lose. Would you? No, you never want to go into that.
Unless you're, a real egomaniac who really is like, ultimately, there's got power issues.
Challenge. I will take over. No, we don't want to. But we don't want to engage with people who are going to constantly look at how they can beat us. So why would we want to do that for other people? So if we rather think about win-win, what would a win look like? And the other person that I really like is. And I've just forgotten his surname, Kim Scott, sorry, the other video, is this idea of a radically candid conversation is where you care personally first, and then challenge directly. And I think that also ties into this idea of we both win. If I'm going into the conversation for my own need, and this is your reciprocity again, just so that I benefit and I deplete your energy and take you down, oh, that conversation is going to be challenging. It's amazing. I've had some really tough conversations. One of the toughest is managing a person and having to fire them, or having the conversation just before, because if they don't change their behavior, they're going to get fired. And they often doesn't feel like a good way to say that. And you want it to be very clear that they are not performing. But actually, I realized, taking the approach of caring personally, what motivated that person? Where do they succeed? Where are they lit up, passionate, fired up? What is ignited in them that I can tap into? Going back to listening and observations, really important, because I could observe this person. I could then use that as my broaching of the conversation, and then be able to address the behavior that wasn't ideal, that was causing them to come across as a poor performer. Because I think that's the other thing. If I just label this person as a poor performer, the story I tell them and the story I'm telling myself and how I enter the conversation, they're a poor performer. But actually, if I realize there's a behavior that gives the impression that they are poor performers, or certain things are leading them to create problems for the team, it's a very different conversation. So I think purpose is really important. What is the purpose that I'm going into this conversation? If I want to rant and just take somebody down, I would say don't have that conversation. I would say do a little bit of.
You might not necessarily be intending to take someone down by ranting. You might just, behaviorally want to get something off your chest. It might not have a negative intention, but actually that brings me to just a spin-off of something you were saying. When you're with someone that sort of where maybe the conversation's gone off on a tangent, or the purpose that you had originally intended is disappeared, and you need to get back onto that track, but because that might be a professional conversation, that's different if it's a friendly conversation. But even then, time might be finite. You may only have a 20-minute window to deliver a particular message, and there's only so much time you can do the niceties and the hello, how's your back. It's about how do we then sort of punctuate or stop someone and say, hold on a minute, let's just go back to what we were talking about earlier. Hold on, that's really interesting, but it also made me think of that excellent exercise that you do in listening with people on the and I wonder if you can just quickly talk it through, and then I'd like to stop and remind everyone, and actually I'll remind everyone now, if you've got any when you are thinking through what makes a good conversation, and what experiences, particularly recently, you've had of a challenging conversation. You don't need to give us details. All we're interested in is what theme, what sort of area was that. So Anne's just given the example of a work scenario where it was a very difficult conversation. But from your perspective, what have been the most difficult conversations recently? And it would be great if you could share that in the chat. And then I'm gonna ask Anne that. Just talk us through. We can't probably do it because we can't get into pairs, because you need to actually practically do it. But maybe everyone can go away and practice it, because actually you become very self-aware through this exercise. The yes and the yes but. Just talk us through that, because that's great.
Yeah, I love that exercise. I wish I could remember who did it with me first, because I must thank them profusely. But the idea of the exercise, and I do recommend you try this, is you get into pairs, and you can either choose to make it a secret, or you can just say it outright. And you say to the person, all right, to the group, you're going to now discuss a project that you're going to be working on. And you tell the one person, and this is what you can do privately or tell them both, that you cannot agree with what that other person is saying. So whatever they say, you have to find fault in it. So if we could try and model it a little bit, let's say we're organizing our end of year, our graduation party, and I start off and I say, I think we should have a garden party for our graduation. And Harriet responds, yes, but we graduate at a time when it's cold and weather is it doesn't work. Like weather is unpredictable and it makes life difficult. And then Harriet, I don't know if you would have a response. What would your idea be for our graduation party?
Yeah, but I think I would like to do something that was a little bit more collaborative or something like that.
Yeah, but the problem is that collaboration just requires so much work. It's so much easier if we could just do it ourselves. So
Oh.
I think that we should just have all white party and just go for it. You and I decide, and then we tell everybody what's to do.
Well, how about we first of all, I don't know, talk and find out what everyone else wants?
Oh, but that's going to take so much time. Let's just go on and do it. And what I was also thinking is that we should have cocktails. There should be cocktails for everyone. Mocktails, maybe. It's been a while since I've been underage. So
Uh,
you get the idea. It
yeah.
just is that we're never on the same page. If you changed that yes but just to yes and, so let's have a garden party, and Harry responded yes, and shall we have a tent just in case the weather is awful? And I'll go, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's have a tent. And shall we do mocktails? Mocktails would work. Maybe not everyone will like them. Shall we have a range of drinks that might work for different people? I that conversation, it feels progressive, and part of that feeling progressive, it just helps to make things move forward. It prevents you from being triggered into all sorts of things, because the minute somebody says but and questions your ideas, your identity trigger goes off. And I don't know if you saw that in that video that of Sheila Heen, but she talks about these three triggers. If I don't believe what you're saying is true, if the way you're telling me or the person you are who's telling me I've got a problem with, or if it triggers my identity. And being told you're wrong is one of those big triggers of your identity, where saying yes and just helps you to feel like you actually are collaborating. And that's, I think Denise and Daniela spoke about both people participating in the conversation.
Mm.
Well, now I feel like I'm participating. I don't feel like we're fighting. So that's a really great exercise to try with a few people, and just see. You can even try it with somebody else. Don't tell them. Just go yes, but yes, but yes, but, and then start going yes and yes and yes and see
Yeah,
see
don't tell them. Just see what happens.
just see what the reaction is.
See what their
Yeah.
body language does. Definitely. I'll tell you something else that came up in my head. So this is the problem. We were talking also earlier. So Anne and I are quite different actually, and almost personify quite different personalities in the conversation. Anne's a very good listener. Also, she's very experienced and knowledgeable about the art of conversation. I am more of I've got lots of experience public speaking, but also I have a very hyperactive brain where I want to talk and get things out. So I have, like a lot of people I know, a little bit of a tendency to sometimes talk over someone because I'm so excited and desperate to get something out, and that I'm not so comfortable with silences. And some people are awesome at silences. It's a fantastic opportunity to become mindful and to listen. But if you've got sort of lots of things coming into your head because you are interacting, that's someone is saying things that are stimulating a response. But there's only so long that you can hold on to those responses. And often you mustn't it's a tricky thing because I think sometimes people think it's a rudeness. It's not necessarily a rudeness. It's an over enthusiasm, possibly, but it's because we don't trust our brains to recall those things. So we're just trying to get them out. Which sort of, in a lot of conversations, I need to take notes at the same time because if I don't write it down, it will be forgotten. So there's different personalities and different personality traits come into difficult conversations, and I've always found that quite fascinating because some people ultimately find quiet listening more straightforward and easy than others. Um, but the thing that I was thinking about is our need for feedback. So one of the motivations for having a conversation, and the sort of conversations perhaps some of the younger people here today who are listening in, their experiences of conversations involve a lot of feedback. Because we're asked whether or not we want it. So an educational reaction and conversation, it's because there's an element of feedback in that discourse, even if that's not very obvious, overt. as we get older, I think we get much worse at dealing with negative feedback, and that links a little bit to that video we've encouraged you all to look at before. And one of them talks about a study that compares the ratios of positive feedback to negative feedback in a conversation, any conversation, a conversation with your partner or boyfriend or girlfriend or your mum or whatever. What's the ratio between what you say that's positive and what's said that's negative? And if it's like a 2 to 1 or a 3 to 1, that's quite harsh to deal with, but it probably means you're quite good at taking feedback. But if there's loads and loads of positive and all wonderful, all wonderful, all wonderful, and very rarely do you say anything negative, that might actually impact the relationship later on. So that feedback thing, I don't know what your experience with that, Anne.
Well, first I love it because you've just sparked off so many different things to do with conversations. So I'm like, which one to pick on?
Sorry,
But
just take any.
yeah, the ratio. So there's a few things. One is that if for any of you who are interested, if you ask for negative feedback, the chances of you getting a raise increases by about 70%. That's thanks for the feedback, Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen. So there is a lot of benefit in being able to ask for negative feedback. Also, a lot of us, we kind of sit at this part where we want to be accepted just as we are, but we also have this burning desire to grow and develop. So that being nice all the time that Harry is talking about is nice, but it's disingenuous after a while, and there is this need for some kind of developmental feedback. So we need to have that. The one ratio I think is really important is just that we've got to, Stephen Covey speaks about this as well, is you want to fill a person's bank account, their emotional bank accounts. So it is important to fill relationships before you start taking away from those relationships. And often that feedback, that negative, or like we like to say, constructive feedback, but it's never easy to be told that you're needing to improve or something you're doing isn't good. But often that is a bit of a depletion. So if you just go into a conversation and all you ever told the person was, you don't pick your stuff off the floor, you don't do your work properly, you don't contribute, oh, why on earth am I part of this relationship, this friendship, this organization? But if there's a lot of the building up of the relationship first, and then occasionally there's just, I love you, right? But there is some points I want to pull my hair out when nothing is ever picked up off the floor. And it's a bit of a joke. It makes life a little bit easier to have those conversations. So that's what I wanted to say on the one. The other was on feedback that you're talking about, and feedback. What I would like to focus on here is to get better at asking for feedback rather than trying to get the art of giving people feedback, because we are just so bombarded by so much stuff and so much of what we need to do differently, and without people trying to empathize in terms of what we really needed, and obviously they can't, that's unhelpful. But if rather we can get better at asking for feedback, it's going to make life so much easier for everyone around you. Because just imagine if I say, I'm doing presentations, it's really important to me, this is what I'm working on, and so I'd love to know if you think my presentation works, if you've got ideas of how I can improve it, if there's some kind of development areas. I've now given you permission to give me feedback. I have set up my status. So you spoke about those power challenges earlier between teacher, student, manager, employee. I've given myself power because I've asked for the feedback. So now when I get it, I'm not worrying about all the things that might be wrong with me. I'm actually able to say, yeah, I asked for that, and thank you. It's appreciative now that you've given me that feedback, because now I've got something to develop, to work on.
Yeah.
And then when you ask for that feedback, and what's that Thanks for the Feedback book is about, is just again realizing your triggers. So it's okay that you get triggered. It's normal. We're going to constantly get triggered. But just like an emotional intelligence, becoming aware of those triggers of, oh, the reason why I want to bash this person over the head is because I don't think they're particularly good at this themselves, and now they're trying to tell me that I'm good, that I need to improve on this. And that's that idea of, if I can dismantle those two conversations, perhaps their feedback is relevant. Just because they're bad at it doesn't mean that I'm good at or better at it than them. Perhaps there is a development area for me. So can I put them into two different conversations. One is, I realize I've got a problem with this relationship. Perhaps I need to have a conversation about it. Perhaps I can let it go. And the second is, I have an area of development that I need to work on. Can I perhaps engage in that and rather just focus on that because it's within my control and I can do something about it?
Yeah. And this is interesting because, of course, not all conversations actually involve much feedback. There are conversations where they're purely functional. So, in a work environment or where it's a case of being given an instruction and checking for understanding, the emotional engagement in that may not be so significant, may not be so massive. But my experience is sometimes that people forget that there is still the emotional involved in even just a functional conversation, even if it's just an exchange of I don't know, I'm just trying to think. Our landlord came here yesterday to inspect the house, and we had a functional conversation, if you like, about what needs doing, what we need to do, all of that sort of thing. But we were also aware that there was an emotional dimension to that because we were looking for reassurances and things like that, but they may not have been coming out in what we were actually saying. So what helps us get better at those sorts of conversations, so that are not a straightforward feedback conversation, that are, almost
Underlying.
instructional.
It's instructional, but there's an underlying. There is,
Mm.
and I think perhaps what you're doing, and I love it, is that you're touching on the fact that you are looking for an element of feedback,
Yeah.
even though you might not have assets. And that leads to one of, even though we're both speaking English, we're not necessarily speaking the same language,
Mm.
which I think is an important thing. You might, and you don't even necessarily know what you want. So going back to your question on purpose, what am I actually wanting from this person inspecting my house? So some of the things to get better is probably to think a little bit more about what your needs are. What do I need from this? And this is on if you're on the receiving end and you're unsure. The other and possibly do some personal development. If you're on the giving side, it's also to try and look at how you can give feedback at different levels or what might be triggers. So I don't know, somebody coming into your house, I also feel it's quite a vulnerable thing. Like you've got
Mm.
you're exposed.
Mm. Mm.
So how can you be professional in the way that you do that, so that you don't leave a person feeling like they're bad? I mean, if you walk around and go,
Yeah.
you know, that you're giving feedback, although you're not giving feedback. So somebody who comes in and just is warm and creates that trust up front, really helps. I am a bit distracted because I see there's a really great question that's
Yeah.
come into me, and it says, "What's the best approach when you feel as though the words that you're saying are not being heard, both in professional and personal situations?" And I love this question because in some ways I feel like it's tying into what you're saying about this feedback. And actually, whilst we're both speaking English, we're not speaking the same language. It also ties into your listening that you were speaking of earlier. And I think it is often that you try to say something to a person, but they're not hearing you, and they're either not. Why? The question I have is, why are they not hearing you? Are they not hearing you because you're not being clear? Are they not hearing you because they are so distracted in their own thoughts? Are they not hearing you because even though you know what you want, I mean, not about clarity, but you don't yet know what it is that you want. So I suppose it speaks into a bit of that clarity. So best approach, one, it depends, I suppose, on how important this conversation is.
Mm.
I've worked with a lot of people who are just really distracted, head people, gotta
Mm.
love it. And so sometimes I just had to pick my battles and be, okay, right, this isn't the right time.
Mm.
If it is something important, what I would try and do is to set up the context, to say what it is that you're really hoping to get. A lovely technique that I find that generally helps people to understand you a bit better is if you use SBI, so situation, behavior, impact.
Mm.
What was the situation you observed? What was the situation you were in? What was the behavior you observed? And what was the impact? And starting that can often help to create the conversation. Which sparks another thought in my head, is that sometimes people can't hear you because you're not giving them a chance to be a part of the conversation. You are speaking at them, or you are you're speaking at them. You're not inviting them to the conversation. So what can be a useful technique as well is to try and invite them into your conversation, and that then might get them to hear it a little bit better themselves, rather than just being told this is how I need to change. Or and sometimes, I mean, it's not just on the negative things of what you need to change, but even if you want to tell somebody that you love them, or that you want to express an enjoyment and enthusiasm on being around them, and you kind of, sometimes what we do is we just tease a person, and I used to do that a lot. We just tease and rag each other, because that was my way of telling you that I quite like you, and that you're a good friend, and I want to be a part of this. But to actually say the words of I'm enjoying your company felt vulnerable. So I suppose sometimes it is that we don't really know how it is that we want to communicate that message, and so we do something like a joke, and then the person misunderstands what we're really trying to say. So the clearer you can be, the better. And if you don't want to say I really like your company, be like, the other day when we went out for movies, and we had that conversation for about an hour before or after. That was really fun. I loved that. I left energized. Then you don't have to tell the person that you're smitten, or that you enjoy the conversation, or any of that kind of vulnerable stuff that leaves you open to being wounded. But it allows you to express something that is real. It's a tangible example, and that can often help with the person hearing you.
I agree. Definitely, with all of that, and similarly thoughts coming to my head. I just want to pause a second here and see if there's anyone that is willing, any of the younger students that are on the call, that are willing to share their experiences, either just through a comment or by talking, so taking off your mute, about a challenging conversation, or just a conversation, a type of conversation they find difficult generally. Is anyone willing to share their thoughts? I've got a great question. No?
And if I haven't answered that other question properly, you're also welcome to challenge me, because I'm assuming a lot of things, which kind of speaks to one of the other points I learned about different conversations. Is it's amazing the stories we tell ourselves, and the assumptions and interpretations that we make, that we take as truth. And it is only in having the conversation, or in challenging that, or asking somebody else to challenge, that we're able to see a whole different perspective. So if I got that completely wrong, you're welcome to either send me another message, or please do speak
up. Something that you talked about earlier that I found interesting too was you went back to your childhood experiences of being one of the younger ones and finding space within an overcrowded room of people competing for space to get their voices heard, again within a finite time frame. I mean, I can relate to that. I was one of three, and there was, everyone was talking. We all talk at each other in my family a lot. I also have a concern because I have a great discomfort of uncomfortable conversations, and I know that's linked to childhood experience too. I have parents that argued a lot and all of that sort of thing. So I would, for a long time in my life, I did anything to avoid a confrontational, difficult conversation. But you learn as you're older and wiser, and that is actually counterproductive. Sometimes you need to have the more difficult conversations, and you just have to learn how to do them. But as an eldest child in a competing environment, and as, again, maybe it's a personality type too, but I've had lots of experiences of instigating conversations, starting, leading, making it happen, facilitating it in the first place, which is another strange one, because again, you make yourself vulnerable by making that up. So for example, you haven't spoken to your friend for 3 or 4 weeks, and so you need to phone her, but it's always you that phones her. Why don't they phone you back? Or you need to make a discussion happen, and a topic that you've been sort of circumnavigating for a long time with someone, you need to bring it up, But you know, deep down, unless it's you that's going to bring it up, it's not going to happen. So that the difficulty sometimes of actually instigating difficult conversations is an interesting one. I don't know if you have anything to speak to that, and anyone else. So anyone else on the call that might have any thoughts on that, I would.
Daniela has sent a lovely long one, so while I give my explanation, you can read that
I'll
and
read that.
go
Yeah.
to
Well,
that.
I'm trying to listen at the same time. Multitask. Multitask.
My dyslexia just gets me all riled up when I have to read and speak at the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
Um, actually, I think probably the situation that comes to mind is one of the ones that stands out is actually with my husband. Although at the time we weren't married, but I'm definitely a people pleaser and just want things to be polite and happy and want people to feel loved and all of that jazz. And I needed to have a difficult conversation with him. Not that he necessarily did anything wrong, but I just like there were things that we were different and I needed to be able to speak about it. And like most people, I had that like worry of, maybe he'll stop loving me and then like I'll lose him and all of those things that we do and stories in our head. And I couldn't and I couldn't and I couldn't. And it was amazing. It just happened one night that we were both lying in the dark and it was just perfectly still. And I managed to find my voice in that moment.
Mm.
And he isn't somebody who will initiate conversations. Talk about Harriet and I are like the same person, twins, in fact, if you can compare my husband and myself. He is definitely your IT introvert, not really going to upset any apple cart at all, and generally very quiet. And so he would never bring up any of these conversations. And I brought up this conversation thinking, oh, where's it going to go? What do I want to say? I don't know how to, and I think I even said, I don't really know how to say this, but I'm struggling with something at the moment. And I want us to speak about it. And it was probably about as simple as that, as to introduce. And then I introduced what it is that I wanted to speak about it. And he engaged. He actually engaged in the conversation. I thought, oh, wow, this is wonderful. And we had one of the best conversations we ever had. And it was probably the pivotal point on really building that trust. I would say up until that point, we were good friends, but, there was a question mark of, if we went our separate ways, we went our separate ways, but just built that trust. And in building that trust and having that conversation, a couple things stood out for me. One, it is difficult to have difficult conversations, to raise those kind of things. So if we are going to do that, try and create the right space. Just allow yourself to be in the right mental state for it. Don't be frazzled. Don't be tired. Don't be in that awkward conversation, in that awkward space for yourself. Try and get yourself into the right space. Try and get rid of distractions. Don't have it in the middle of a mall somewhere or shopping center where there are people all around, or where there are friends to impress, or there's other things that are going to be confusing, or it's in the classroom with teachers and all your colleagues, classmates in the classroom with you, and now you're going to raise it. So creating that safe space was an important one. The other was really to slow down for difficult conversations. Slow down and just try and name what it is you really want to say, and name it not to blame the other person. Name it because you want this relationship to work. So your friend that never calls you and you need to call them up because you want that relationship to work. Or don't if you don't. But if that's what you're wanting, then
I think linked to that is also to create that space, that comfortable space to have a difficult conversation, is to also empathize with a person that's trying to do something that is evidently difficult for them to do. So it's quite clear when someone, if you try and start a conversation, I don't know how to say this, and it might be quite difficult, but to show that you appreciate that. And I know I'm recalling difficult conversations over my life, and one of the most helpful things anyone can ever say is, thank you for bringing this up or addressing this. I know that wasn't easy. That level of empathy is very, very powerful. And again, we only learn this stuff by doing it, but actually this conversation today twixt you and me is a way of revisiting the core ingredients of what make good conversation. So let's go to this question, because I think this is great. And so this, and I've got lots of examples in my own head. The same, it's that found that one challenging conversation I've had involved a friend who confided in me about an issue, but a personal issue, but I felt wasn't able to respond appropriately, or give that feedback, as I had no experience in that area and found it difficult to sympathize with them. So is there anything to advise in a conversation like that? And I'm sure all of us have an example of that, and it speaks to me to one of the what I believe the hardest skill of all is empathy, human empathy. We're built with it, but it's really hard, and I'm not sure it ever particularly gets easier. I think we have it, but it will always be hard, and it's having that empathy. But anyway, what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, so the first thing that stands out for me is I didn't have the respond appropriately or give that feedback. And I think that's probably one of the, perhaps if I can invite you to calm that voice down, is that when somebody's sharing something with you that's personal, try and stop with thinking about what that brilliant advice that you're going to give them, that you have to give them, and that feedback. I would say the first thing is just get curious and possibly ask questions to find out more. Clarify if you need to clarify, or just, I mean, if you can sometimes sense, so I can sense from your response that you knew that was personal, that was deeply personal. So the first thing even there is like, is to say thank you, that was personal and that you've been vulnerable, and I thank you for sharing that with me. And I don't know if they were asking for advice, but just to start with, do you want to speak about it more? And let them, give them their airtime. I think what has helped me is actually going through tough things in my life. I think I am quite an empathetic person, instilled by my very caring family who got us doing all sorts of wonderful things when we were younger. But I never, for example, I've had 2 miscarriages, which might not relate to many people here yet, I hope. But they're tough. And some of you might have lost a family member. Some of you might have dealt with depression. Some of you might have tried to harm yourselves. You might have been going through things. Maybe it was losing a pet or something like that. And I do find, and this is sometimes perhaps it leads on to something else. We don't always have to be searching for life to be this happy, perfect, white picket fence life. Actually, it's really wonderful when things aren't perfect. So, bit off on a tangent. Coming back to your question there, just allow that person to be if you can. Try not to think about the feedback you have to give them, just to listen and to accept them. There's a question I have, is that feedback, was it fundamentally what they're sharing, something that you disagreed with and goes against your beliefs? That is very challenging because you've got to try and quieten that voice. But if it wasn't, if it was more about them being personal and just sharing something that they're struggling with, allow them to be who they are without judgment, and see if you can allow them to speak and share a little bit more through asking questions.
Well, I think and that's all linked to the. So I've done a little bit of counselling training over the years when I was a university lecturer, and one of the things I remember most was how to reframe something that someone tells you as a question to ask them back. So it doesn't require you to have any particular knowledge or insight or judgment. It's about reframing what they've just told you to show that you're listening. So it's like, if I've understood you correct, is it that la 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 la? And that skill is fantastic. But the art of reframing questions is fantastic anyway, and it's what we can all get better at in order to see an issue or a problem from another perspective. But and by reframing the question, that's exactly possibly what you're doing. You're helping them by helping them see it possibly from a different perspective. And so the art of reframing a question within a conversation, exactly as that's said in this question, when you feel a bit unable to give an opinion or perspective, or you're worried that might not help the situation, by just reframing what that person said will be immensely helpful in itself.
Yes.
I think.
And something that I always said to managers, if it's something personal as an employee, is also, so I love what you're saying, Harry, because I think that is really useful. If there is this worry about what they've shared needs help that I am not qualified to get, then you can potentially offer to help them get that right advice from the right person. So just extreme case if that is happening. But if it's more within your control and they're needing to just speak, I've had that with somebody where I wasn't sure how to respond and I thought they might need extra help. But actually, it was just something that they were sharing. And through conversations, we've been able to understand each other a lot better and understand what some of the problems are. So just allow them to be. They'll come back for more. You can pick it up later. Give yourself a bit of room if you want to. And a week later, when you see them again, saying, I've been thinking about what you shared, and this is what's come up for me now. So you can also come back to them sometimes if you don't know what to say straight away. But I love that, reframe and give it back to them and help them to see it, because that's often what we're really asking for. Is I'm putting it out there because I'm trying to deal with this, and I don't know how to, and I don't know what I'm seeing, and I don't know what I'm hearing, and I'm too far in the arena, in the game, for me to see it myself. So I need your help.
Yeah, excellent. Right, we have run out of time. We've got to be quite fierce on time today, sadly. So I'm going to wrap up quickly. I would love to give one more minute. If anyone wants to say anything, any reflections or thoughts, please do. Denise, you too. You haven't said anyone that wants to. I'm going to email you this really helpful document that Anne's produced actually from her experience of working on doing training on conversations. Next week is with Mike Friedman, and he's awesome at helping us, all of us, any age. In fact, I really want to invite teachers too to this one, because it's not age specific at all, about finding our purpose and our passion, and he's going to give us some exercises for that, and there's something in advance you'll need to do, but you'll get lots out of that, so please come along to that one. So is there anyone else that wants to say anything before we finish? No? All right, well, thank you, Anne. Thank you for
Wait,
joining us. Oh,
sorry.
anything else?
There's a question. Is there a recording from the last two sessions?
There is, but we can't share the whole thing. We're trying to put together snippets and things of them, aren't we? But there is the whole thing, because of uh, having under 18s on the call. We can't have names. If we can find a way of not showing any names, then we might be able to do something with them. I don't know.
We can also share the audio. So all of our
Oh
recordings have
yeah,
audio. So if you're okay to listen to a podcast version of us
yeah,
speaking, and we can share that with you without any problems.
yeah. A podcast
I
version.
would just love to acknowledge all the participation today. Thank you so much. It's definitely helped me feel like I'm not speaking into the abyss. But thank you for participating, for chatting, for being part of this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, and see you all next week. Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.